He was driving his imported car in a hurry, focused on meetings and profits, until stopped on the tracks, about to be crushed. He was saved by the persistent cries of an unknown child. A small girl with only a loaf of bread in her bag saved him with her silent courage. If you were touched by this beautiful story of resilience and love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing. Blake Harrington woke up surrounded by the elegant silence of his Manhattan penthouse, its pristine white walls reflecting the first rays of dawn through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view of equally tall and luxurious buildings stretching across the New York skyline would have impressed anyone else, but for Blake, it was merely the backdrop of another tedious morning. His Italian silk sheets rustled as he reached for his phone, immediately irritated by the flood of pending notifications. 42 emails, 17 missed calls, and a string of text messages from board members demanding updates on quarterly projections. At 38, Blake had mastered the art of existing purely for profit. As CEO of Harrington Capital, one of Wall Street's most aggressive investment firms, he measured time only in transactions and opportunities. While his personal valet, Thomas, laid out a hand-tailored Brioni suit, Blake was already reviewing reports and confirming million-dollar transfers. His mind constantly calculated, optimized, and strategized. There was no room for thoughts unrelated to business, no space for sentiments that didn't translate to dollar signs. "Your schedule today, sir," Thomas said, placing a printed itinerary beside a breakfast Blake would barely touch. "The board meeting has been moved to 9 instead of 10, and Mr. Richardson insisted on lunch at Le Bernardin to discuss the Westbrook acquisition." Blake nodded without looking up from his phone. "Cancel the Davidson meeting this afternoon. Their numbers don't justify my time." "Very good, sir." "And regarding the charity gala invitation for Friday," "Decline it," Blake cut him off. "Send a check if necessary, but I won't waste an evening on performative philanthropy." Thomas nodded and disappeared silently, leaving Blake to his empire of spreadsheets and stock tickers. Blake left his apartment before the sun had fully risen, preferring to beat the worst of Manhattan traffic. He drove himself in his custom Aston Martin, enjoying the control, the purr of the engine, as he navigated the grid of city streets. Unlike most New Yorkers, Blake refused to relinquish the wheel to drivers or taxis. Control was his addiction, even if only over machines. He barely registered the city waking up around him, the small coffee carts setting up on corners, early commuters hurrying to subway entrances, delivery trucks double-parked along narrow streets. All seemed insignificant, nearly invisible from behind the tinted windows of luxury. His life was a succession of cold decisions. Other people's lives were inconsequential background noise. As he drove, his car's digital display lit up with an incoming call. The name Jonathan Pearson, board chairman, flashed prominently. Blake answered quickly, expecting the usual updates. "Harrington," he answered crisply. The voice on the other end wasn't as pleasant as he'd expected. "Blake, the projections for Q3 are completely unacceptable. Westbrook's acquisition needs to happen this quarter, not next, and we need to be looking at 3 more similar targets before the fiscal year ends." Each sentence landed like a blade against Blake's pride. His heart rate increased, mind immediately calculating possible solutions, strategic cuts, mergers, targeted destructions of competing firms. Nothing rattled him more than the possibility of failure in front of investors. He'd spent his entire adult life climbing to this position, and he refused to show weakness. "I'm already addressing it," Blake replied, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. "I'm meeting with Richardson today to finalize Westbrook, and I have my team preparing reports on Avery Tech and Global Serve as additional acquisitions." "Not enough," Pearson snapped. "The board is getting restless. Blackstone is outperforming us this quarter, and we're losing ground with the Singapore investors. Whatever you think you're doing, do more." Blake's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. "Understood." The call ended abruptly, leaving Blake with a familiar hollow feeling in his chest. It wasn't quite fear. He'd trained himself out of fear years ago, but rather a cold determination that bordered on desperation. He'd claw his way through whatever obstacle appeared, regardless of collateral damage. That's how he'd built his Reputation, his fortune, his life. Lost in thought, he didn't notice when he turned onto a secondary street cutting through a neglected part of the Bronx, a shortcut he sometimes took to avoid traffic on the bridge. His mind was too occupied with calculating how many people he'd need to fire to boost the quarterly numbers, which departments could be consolidated, which expenses could be eliminated. Meanwhile, on a cracked sidewalk, forgotten by city maintenance, 10-year-old Lily Thompson approached a street vendor selling fresh bread from a small cart. The aroma of warm bread mingled with the smell of rust and burnt oil from the nearby train tracks. Her dark eyes carefully counted the coins in her small hand, calculating whether she could afford the larger loaf to share with her mother and younger brothers. The vendor, Mr. Guzman, smiled sadly at the single-dollar bill and quarters she extended. Nevertheless, he took the largest bread and placed it in a transparent plastic bag, handing it to her without comment. He knew he wouldn't receive the full price, but he preferred losing a few cents rather than denying food to a child so small. Lily gave him a quick smile and continued walking, hugging the bag against her chest. Her eyes focused on the ground, where puddles of muddy water reflected the grey sky above. Her thoughts were simple: get home before the bread cooled, divide it equally, maybe save a piece for tomorrow's breakfast. Her mother would be leaving for her second cleaning job soon, and Lily needed to watch her brothers until she returned late tonight. It was during this walk that she saw the expensive car stopped on the train tracks. It was beautiful, shiny like a mirror, with headlights shaped like eagle eyes, but it was motionless, blocking the path of the train that was already approaching around the bend. Inside, a man in an expensive suit was talking on his phone. His face looked angry, concerned only with the glowing screen before him, completely unaware of the danger. For a moment, Lily thought about running straight home. It was too dangerous to get involved, but her feet moved before her reasoning finished. She ran to the car, shouted, gestured, pointed to the track, to the train that appeared in the distance like a metal monster. The man didn't hear her at first. He was too busy arguing about stocks, contracts, mergers, billions. When he finally noticed the small girl outside, his face frowned with irritation. But then, the piercing sound of the train horn filled the air. The train was already too close. He dropped his phone, looked around, stepped hard on the accelerator, and sped away with the car seconds before the locomotive passed, tearing through the space with its heavy, fast body. The ground trembled. The train's hot wind hit Lily, tossing her fine hair and raising dust around her. She blinked several times, but didn't move from the spot until she was sure the car was safe, away from the tracks. Inside the vehicle, Blake breathed heavily. His heart was beating so fast it seemed to want to jump out of his chest. He was safe, but he didn't feel immediate gratitude, only shock. He was still holding the steering wheel tightly when he decided to look in the rearview mirror. Then he saw the small, fragile image of that child, standing on the sidewalk holding her bag of bread. She looked at him without any expression of anger or demand. There was nothing there but a deep calmness, as if she had just fulfilled something obvious and necessary. He didn't know what to do. His initial instinct was to keep driving, return to his phone, resume the interrupted call. But something inside him burned with discomfort. There was a sensation he didn't recognize, something that resembled shame. He slowly put the car in reverse, approached her, lowered the window. He said nothing, just looked at that child up close. Her eyes were large, dark, deep as bottomless wells. In them there was no fear nor idolatry. There was only life. She didn't understand the value of imported cars or Swiss watches, but she understood the value of a few seconds. She understood the value of staying alive. He felt his throat tighten. For a moment he thought about offering money. He would take out a large bill and hand it through the window, resolving that uncomfortable feeling. But before he could move his hand to his wallet, she smiled, shook her head gently in refusal, and turned to leave, hugging her bag of bread. Blake remained, there watching her walk until she disappeared among the grey houses. Then he looked ahead, feeling his heart beat differently, as if he had awakened from a long sleep. "Wait," he called out suddenly, surprising himself with the urgency in his voice. But she was already gone, swallowed by the maze of tenement buildings and narrow alleys. The train had long passed, leaving behind only the lingering smell of metal and oil in the air. Blake sat motionless in his luxury car, a foreign object in this forgotten corner of the city. For the first time in years, the notifications buzzing on his phone seemed distant and meaningless. He checked the time. 8:47 a.m. The board meeting would start in 13 minutes. He would not make it. Blake Harrington, who had never been late to a meeting in his entire professional career, found himself unable to move, transfixed by the empty space where a small girl had stood moments ago. His phone rang again. Jonathan Pearson. Blake watched it ring until it stopped, then ring again. And for the first time since he could remember, Blake Harrington chose not to answer. Blake stared at his silent phone for what seemed like an eternity. The boardroom across town would be filling with impatient executives, checking their watches, exchanging glances. Jonathan Pearson would be fuming, his face turning that particular shade of crimson that Blake had come to recognize as the prelude to someone's termination. Yet here he sat, in a run-down neighborhood he'd normally speed through without a second glance, unable to shake the image of those dark, knowing eyes. The girl couldn't have been older than 10, but there had been something ancient in her gaze, something that had cut through years of carefully constructed armor. "This is ridiculous," Blake muttered to himself, finally putting the car in drive. But instead of heading toward Manhattan and the waiting board members, he found himself slowly cruising through the neighborhood, looking down each street and alleyway. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his assistant, Vanessa. "Where are you?" she hissed when he answered. "The entire board is waiting. Pearson is about to have an aneurysm." "Cancel it," Blake said, surprising himself. "Cancel the board meeting? Are you serious?" "Yes. Tell them I had a medical emergency." "Are you okay? Do you need me to call someone?" "I'm fine, Vanessa. Just reschedule for tomorrow and clear my calendar for the rest of the day." "Blake, you have the Richardson lunch about Westbrook, and then—" "Cancel everything," he said firmly. "I'll be unavailable until tomorrow." Ended the call before she could protest further, then turned his phone off completely, something he hadn't done in over a decade. The neighborhood looked different now that he was actually seeing it. The buildings were worn but dignified, many dating back to the 1920s with architectural details that spoke of a more prosperous era. Laundry hung from fire escapes, colorful against the faded brick. Children played in small concrete courtyards, while elderly residents watched from benches, their faces lined with stories Blake would never know. He parked near a small bodega and stepped out of his car, immediately feeling out of place in his $5,000 suit. The few pedestrians gave him curious or suspicious glances. A businessman like him in this neighborhood usually meant gentrification, evictions, or some other unwelcome change. The bodega's bell jangled as Blake entered. The shop was narrow but deep, crammed with necessities and small luxuries. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone neutral but eyes watchful. "I'm looking for information," Blake said, then hesitated. What exactly was he looking for? There was a young girl, about 10 years old, dark hair, wearing a blue jacket. She was buying bread nearby. Man's expression hardened. "Why are you looking for her?" Blake realized how suspicious he must sound, an obviously wealthy stranger asking about a child. "She helped me earlier. I just wanted to thank her." "We look after our own here," the man said coldly. "If you're really grateful, there are better ways to show it than tracking down a kid." Blake nodded, a strange feeling of shame washing over him again. "You're right. I apologize." He looked around the store, noticing the limited selection, the carefully arranged goods that had been strategically placed to hide the empty spaces on the shelves. "How long have you had this store?" he asked, changing tactics. The man seemed surprised by the question. 22 years. My father had it before me for 30. "It's a nice place," Blake said, and meant it. Despite its modest appearance, the bodega had a warmth that his sterile penthouse lacked. "I'm Blake, by the way." "Miguel," the man replied, still cautious but slightly less hostile. Blake wandered through the narrow aisles, noting the prices. Everything was carefully selected to provide maximum value for minimal cost. This was a store that understood its customers' needs. The bread, Blake said suddenly. The girl was buying bread. Where would that have come from? Miguel studied him for a moment before answering. Probably from Ernesto. He sells fresh bread from a cart near the train crossing, 2 blocks east, then north 1 block. Blake thanked him and left, walking rather than driving. The neighborhood felt different on foot, more immediate. He could smell cooking from open windows, hear music and conversation in various languages, feel the uneven sidewalk beneath his Italian leather shoes. He found the bread vendor easily enough, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes, selling from a cart painted in faded blue and white. The remaining loaves looked fresh and smelled wonderful. "Excuse me," Blake approached. "I'm looking for a young girl who bought bread from you earlier today. Dark hair, about this tall." He gestured with his hand. The vendor, Ernesto presumably, regarded him with the same suspicion Miguel had shown. "Why are you looking for Lily?" Lily. She had a name now. "She helped me today," Blake explained, deciding honesty was the best approach. "I was stopped on the train tracks on a call, didn't notice the train coming. She warned me. I just wanted to thank her properly." Ernesto's expression softened slightly. "That sounds like Lily. Always looking out for others, even when she has so little herself." He paused, studying Blake's expensive clothes. "You're not from around here?" "No," Blake admitted, "but I'd like to help her if I can." "Help her how? By throwing money at her? That's what you rich folks always think is the answer." The accusation stung partly because it was accurate. Blake had indeed thought of simply giving the girl Lily money. It was his solution to most problems. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just know I need to do something." Ernesto seemed surprised by his honesty. "Lily Thompson lives with her mother, Sarah, and her 2 younger brothers in the apartment building with the green door. 3 blocks that way," he pointed. "They're good people. Sarah works 2 jobs, cleaning offices downtown and waitressing. At the diner on weekends. Lily helps take care of her brothers. They don't take handouts, but they could use real help." Blake thanked him and bought all the remaining bread, asking Ernesto to distribute it to families who needed it. Then he walked in the direction Ernesto had indicated, finding himself in front of a 5-story tenement building with peeling paint and a faded green door. Several children played on the stoop, falling silent as he approached. "Does Lily Thompson live here?" he asked. A boy of about 8 nodded cautiously. "Apartment 3B, but she's at school now." "Everyone's at school except us." He gestured to a younger child beside him who was coughing. "We're sick today." Blake thanked him and retreated, feeling increasingly out of place. What was he doing here? What did he hope to accomplish? He had a company to run, acquisitions to complete, a board to appease. Yet none of that seemed to matter in the face of what he'd experienced this morning. He found a small park nearby and sat on a bench, watching mothers with strollers and elderly residents feeding pigeons. The neighborhood had a rhythm he'd never noticed before, a community that functioned despite, or perhaps because of, its limited resources. Blake checked his watch. 11:37 a.m. By now, his absence would have caused a minor corporate earthquake. Vanessa would be fielding calls from concerned executives and angry board members. The Richardson lunch would have been cancelled, potentially jeopardizing the Westbrook acquisition. His carefully constructed world of power and influence was likely crumbling in his absence. And strangely, he didn't care. A school bell rang in the distance, and soon the park began filling with children released for lunch break. Some had packed lunches, others headed home for a quick meal before returning. Blake watched them, their carefree energy and genuine laughter, a stark contrast to the forced politeness and calculated interactions of his usual environment. And then he saw her. Lily was walking with 2 other girls, carrying a worn backpack over one shoulder. She looked different in daylight, smaller, more vulnerable, yet somehow still carrying that same serene confidence he'd witnessed earlier. Blake stood, uncertain what to do. Would she recognize him? Should he approach her? What would he even say? Before he could decide, Lily looked up and saw him. Recognition flashed in her eyes, followed by confusion. She said something to her friends, who continued on without her, then cautiously approached where Blake stood. "You're the man from the car," she said simply. "The one on the train tracks." Blake nodded, suddenly finding himself at a loss for words. He, who could command boardrooms and intimidate business rivals, felt uncomfortably tongue-tied before this child. "I wanted to thank you," he finally managed. "You saved my life today." Lily shrugged, a gesture too mature for her years. Anyone would have done it. "No," Blake said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most people would have walked away, assumed it wasn't their problem." She looked at him curiously. "Why would they do that? You were in danger." The question hit Blake with unexpected force. Why indeed? When had he become so indifferent to others' suffering? "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm grateful you didn't." He hesitated, then added, "I'd like to help you and your family, if I can." Lily's expression changed, a wariness entering her eyes. "We don't need charity, sir." "Not charity," Blake said quickly. "Just, I owe you a debt. Please let me repay it somehow." She studied him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through his expensive suit to the confused soul beneath. "My mom says we can only accept gifts that come from the heart, not from obligation or pity." Blake felt something shift inside him, a perspective changing. What if it's neither? What if it's gratitude? Lily considered this, then gave him a small smile. "I have to get home now. My brothers will be hungry." "Of course," Blake said, stepping back. "I didn't mean to keep you." She turned to go, then paused. "If you really want to help, Mr. Harrington, Blake Harrington. Mr. Harrington, if you really want to help, our school library needs new books. Most of ours are falling apart, and some are so old they still say Pluto is a planet." She gave him a quick, shy smile, then hurried away toward the green door building. Blake stood in the park long after she'd disappeared, feeling as though something fundamental had changed. His phone remained off in his pocket, his car parked blocks away, his carefully scheduled day in ruins. Yet somehow, for the first time in years, Blake Harrington felt awake. Blake returned to his penthouse that evening to find 3 urgent messages from Jonathan Pearson, 5 from the company's legal team, and a formal email requesting his presence at an emergency board meeting the following morning. Vanessa had left a carefully worded voicemail expressing concern for his well-being, while simultaneously conveying the corporate chaos his absence had caused. He should have cared. He should have immediately called Pearson, smoothed things over, assured the board that everything was under control. Instead, he poured himself a glass of 30-year-old scotch and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's glittering skyline. The city looked different tonight. Rather than seeing symbols of achievement and power, Blake found himself wondering about the people inside those buildings. How many were like him, trapped in golden cages of their own making? How many measured their worth solely in dollars and deals? How many had forgotten what it meant to act simply because something was right, not because it offered a return on investment? His phone rang again. Pearson. Blake let it go to voicemail. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched for Bronx, elementary schools near train tracks. Several results appeared. After cross-referencing with the location where he'd met Lily, he narrowed it down to PS 47, the John Randolph School. The school's website was basic and outdated. The library section featured photos of a small room with sparse shelving and worn books. A notice at the bottom solicited donations, mentioning that the library's annual budget had been cut to just $500, barely enough to replace damaged books, let alone acquire new ones. Blake stared at the screen, a strange feeling growing in his chest. $500. His watch had cost more than 100 times that amount. The fountain pen sitting on his desk was worth nearly $3,000. The absurdity of it struck him suddenly, a harsh contrast that made him uncomfortably aware of his own excess. On impulse, he called his private banker. "James, I need to make a donation." $50,000 to PS47 in the Bronx, specifically for their library. I want it done anonymously, processed immediately. Of course, Mr. Harrington. Would you like this structured as a tax-deductible charitable contribution through your foundation? Blake hesitated. The question highlighted his usual approach. Even his charitable giving was strategically designed for maximum financial benefit. No, he said firmly. Just a direct donation. No recognition, no tax documentation, and James, I need absolute discretion on this. Understood, sir. I'll process it tonight. Blake ended the call and returned to the window. $50,000 was nothing to him, a rounding error in his personal accounts. Yet he knew it would transform that small school library. It bothered him how easy it was, how little sacrifice the gesture required. Was it really meaningful if it cost him nothing? His thoughts were interrupted by another call, this time from his lawyer, Mitchell. Blake, what the hell is going on? The board is in an uproar. Pearson's talking about invoking the emergency succession clause if you don't show up tomorrow. They can't remove me that easily, Blake replied, surprised by his own calmness. I own 30% of the company. They can make things very difficult. The Westbrook deal is hanging by a thread, and Richardson is threatening to take their business elsewhere. Blake, you've never missed a meeting in 15 years, let alone disappeared for an entire day. People are concerned. I had some personal matters to attend to. Personal matters? Mitchell sounded incredulous. You don't have personal matters. You've cancelled vacations for quarterly reports. You took a conference call during your father's funeral. The mention of his father sent an unexpected pang through Blake. He had indeed taken that call, stepping out of the sparsely attended service to close a deal that seemed desperately important at the time. Now he couldn't even remember what company they'd been acquiring. Things change, Mitchell. I'll handle the board tomorrow. What should I tell them tonight? Tell them. Blake paused, looking out at the city again. Tell them I'm reassessing priorities. He ended the call before Mitchell could respond, then turned his phone off again. The silence in his penthouse felt oppressive suddenly, the minimalist design and expensive furnishings seeming cold rather than elegant. Blake realized he'd designed this space to impress visitors, not for his own comfort. In fact, he rarely had visitors. His life was almost exclusively work, with occasional carefully curated social appearances that were themselves forms of business. When was the last time he'd done something simply for enjoyment? When had he last experienced genuine connection with another person? He tried to remember, but the memories were dusty, relegated to a past that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Blake slept poorly that night, his dreams filled with train horns and a small figure standing on tracks, waving desperately, as he sat unseeing in his car, focused on his phone while destruction barreled toward him. He awoke at 5 a.m., earlier than usual, and dressed in his typical armor, a perfect suit, gleaming shoes, tie precisely knotted. But as he caught his reflection in the mirror, something felt off. The man staring back at him looked hollow, a shell polished to perfection, but empty inside. On impulse, Blake loosened his tie slightly and left his collar button undone. A small rebellion, but it felt significant. He arrived at Harrington Capital's headquarters on Wall Street at precisely 8:30 a.m. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9. As he walked through the glass and steel lobby, employees stared, then quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't noticed anything unusual about their CEO's day-long absence, followed by his slightly disheveled appearance this morning. Vanessa was waiting at his office door, clipboard in hand, expression carefully neutral, despite the obvious relief in her eyes. "Good morning, Blake. The board is assembling in the main conference room. I've prepared the Westbrook files and the quarterly projections. Legal has drafted a statement addressing yesterday's situation." "Thank you, Vanessa," Blake said, then surprised her by adding, "I appreciate your handling things in my absence." She blinked, momentarily thrown by the unexpected gratitude. "Of course, that's my job." "Still, thank you." He entered his office, leaving her staring after him in confusion. The space was exactly as he'd left it yesterday, imposing desk position to maximize the power dynamic, with visitors, awards, and financial publications strategically displayed, nothing personal in sight. No family photos, no mementos, nothing that wasn't carefully selected to project success and authority. Blake sat at his desk, seeing it through new eyes. This office, like his apartment, was a stage set designed to intimidate and impress. It revealed nothing about him as a person, because he realized with a jolt he'd stopped being a person long ago. He'd become a function, a machine designed to acquire and accumulate. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Harrington, the board is ready for you," Vanessa announced. Blake gathered the files she'd prepared and walked to the conference room, mentally rehearsing explanations and reassurances. He would smooth this over, as he'd smoothed over countless other situations. He would maintain control. The room fell silent as he entered. 12 board members sat around the long table, expressions ranging from concern to poorly concealed hostility. Jonathan Pearson stood at the head of the table, hands planted firmly on the polished surface. "Blake," he said, voice clipped, "we were beginning to wonder if you'd grace us with your presence today." "My apologies for yesterday," Blake replied smoothly, taking his seat. "A personal emergency required my immediate attention." "A personal emergency," Pearson repeated, skepticism evident. "One that prevented you from making a single phone call or sending a text message." "Yes," Blake said simply, offering no further explanation. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "Well," Pearson finally continued, "while you were dealing with your emergency, the Westbrook deal nearly collapsed. Richardson was understandably concerned by your absence, and Blackstone has made a competing offer." "I spoke with Richardson this morning," Blake lied effortlessly. "The situation is under control." "Is it? Because from where we're sitting, it appears that you've lost focus. The concerns I expressed yesterday clearly weren't taken seriously. The board needs to know that you're fully committed to Harrington Capital's growth strategy." Blake looked around the table, at these men and women he'd worked alongside for years. Had any of them ever had a moment like he'd experienced yesterday? Had they ever questioned the relentless pursuit of profit that consumed their lives? "The Westbrook acquisition will proceed," Blake said carefully, "but I've been considering some adjustments to our overall strategy." Pearson's eyes narrowed. "What kind of adjustments?" "I believe we should explore more sustainable growth models. Our current approach of aggressive acquisition followed by mass layoffs and restructuring is creating diminishing returns." "That approach has delivered 20% year-over-year growth for the past decade," one board member interjected. "Yes," Blake acknowledged, "but at what cost? We're developing a reputation that's making potential acquisitions increasingly hostile. We're facing higher turnover rates in key positions, and we're missing opportunities for organic growth through actual innovation rather than mere consolidation." The room erupted in objections and questions. Blake let them talk, watching their faces, recognizing the fear beneath their anger. They were afraid of change, afraid of anything that might threaten the system that had made them wealthy and powerful. He had been exactly the same until yesterday. "Gentlemen, ladies," Blake said, raising his hand for silence, "I'm not suggesting we abandon our core business model. I'm proposing we evolve it. The market is changing and we need to change with it." "This sounds like weakness," Pearson said bluntly. "If you're losing your edge, Blake, perhaps it's time to consider stepping aside." "My edge is precisely what I'm maintaining," Blake countered, looking ahead instead of clinging to outdated strategies. "But if the board lacks confidence in my leadership, you're welcome to call a vote." It was a calculated risk. Blake knew that despite Pearson's bluster, the board wouldn't remove him. His track record was too strong, his ownership stake too significant. And most importantly, none of them wanted the public scrutiny that would come with ousting their CEO. Pearson stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Let's discuss these adjustments in more detail." The meeting continued for 3 hours, a tense negotiation that eventually resulted in a compromise. Blake would proceed with the Westbrook acquisition, but would present a revised strategic plan at the next quarterly meeting. It was a small victory, but it bought him time. As the board members filed out, Pearson lingered behind. "What really happened yesterday, Blake?" he asked, his tone less hostile now that they were alone. Blake considered telling him the truth, then decided against it. How could he explain a transformation he barely understood himself? "Let's just say I had a wake-up call," he replied. Pearson studied him for a moment. "Be careful, Blake. I've seen this before. Midlife crisis, sudden urge to give back or find meaning. It passes. Don't make decisions now that you'll regret when you come to your senses." Blake smiled thinly. "I appreciate your concern, Jonathan, but I believe I'm just now coming to my senses." Alone in his office afterward, Blake felt strangely energized. The confrontation had clarified something for him. He didn't need to abandon his company or his responsibilities, but perhaps he could transform them, use his position and resources in ways that created value beyond mere profit. His phone buzzed with a text from his banker. "Donation processed. School administration quite surprised. Asked twice if there was a mistake in the amount." Blake smiled, a genuine expression that felt foreign on his face. It was a small beginning, but it was something real. For the next 2 weeks, Blake maintained a careful balance. During the day, he was the ruthless CEO his board and shareholders expected, negotiating the Westbrook acquisition with his usual precision. But in the evenings, he found himself drawn back to the Bronx, to the neighborhood that had somehow broken through his carefully constructed walls. He was cautious at first, driving through slowly, observing from a distance. He saw Lily occasionally, walking home from school with her brothers, or helping her mother carry groceries. He resisted the urge to approach her, unsure what he would say if he did. Instead, he began researching. Blake had built his fortune on understanding systems, finding weaknesses and exploiting opportunities. Now he applied those same skills to understanding this community. He hired a discreet research firm to compile data on the neighborhood: employment rates, income levels, housing conditions, educational outcomes. The results were sobering but not surprising. The area had been systematically underserved. For decades, caught in cycles of poverty perpetuated by institutional neglect and economic policies that favored wealthy districts. Blake scheduled a meeting with his foundation's director, Caroline Foster, a sharp-minded woman who managed his philanthropic ventures, which he now realized had been more about tax benefits than actual impact. "I want to redirect our efforts," he told her, sliding a folder across the desk. "This neighborhood in the Bronx, I want comprehensive support. Educational programs, housing improvements, small business grants, healthcare initiatives." Caroline reviewed the materials, her expression professional but curious. "This is quite different from our usual focus on high-profile arts organizations and university endowments. May I ask what prompted the change?" "Let's just say I've gained some perspective," Blake replied. "Can it be done?" "Of course. The foundation has considerable resources." She hesitated. "But traditionally, you've preferred projects with prominent recognition opportunities. This appears to be less visible." "I want these initiatives to be anonymous," Blake said firmly. "No naming rights, no press releases, no public acknowledgement of my involvement." Caroline couldn't hide her surprise. "That's highly unusual, especially for the scale of investment you're suggesting. Nevertheless, that's how we'll proceed. I want results, not recognition." She nodded, making notes. "I'll develop a comprehensive proposal. However, I should point out that sustainable community development requires long-term commitment. This isn't something we can simply throw money at and walk away." "I understand," Blake said. "I'm prepared for that commitment." After she left, Blake sat at his desk, contemplating the strange dual life he was beginning to lead. Part of him wondered if Pearson was right, if this was merely a temporary crisis of conscience that would pass. But deep down, he knew something fundamental had shifted that day on the train tracks. He couldn't unsee what he'd seen, couldn't unfeel what he'd felt. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Richardson on line 1 about the Westbrook closing," Vanessa announced. Blake picked up the phone, seamlessly transitioning back to the role he'd perfected over years. "David, good to hear from you. I trust you've reviewed the final terms." That evening, Blake found himself once again driving to the Bronx. He'd received an email that morning from PS47's principal, thanking the anonymous donor for the generous library contribution. The message mentioned a small ceremony planned for Friday afternoon to unveil the renovated space and new books. Blake parked several blocks away and walked to the school, arriving just as families were gathering in the playground. He stayed at the perimeter, watching as excited children led parents and siblings toward the entrance, where a handmade banner proclaimed, "Grand Reopening PS47 Library." He spotted Lily immediately, helping her mother manage two energetic younger boys. Sarah Thompson looked exhausted but proud, straightening her son's collars and managing a smile despite what Blake imagined had been a long day of cleaning offices downtown. The principal, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, welcomed everyone, with visible emotion. "Today marks a new chapter for our school," she announced. "Thanks to an incredibly generous anonymous donation, our library has been completely transformed. We've added over 2,000 new books, new computers, comfortable seating, and even a dedicated storytelling corner for our youngest readers." Blake watched the reactions, teachers wiping away tears, parents exchanging hopeful glances, children bouncing with excitement. The impact of his donation was tangible, immediate, and real in a way that the abstract numbers in his financial statements had never been. When the doors opened and people flooded inside, Blake remained outside, content to observe from a distance. Through the windows he could see children running to shelves, pulling out colorful books, exclaiming over discoveries. He saw Lily helping one of her brothers find a book about dinosaurs, her face lit with quiet joy. "It was you, wasn't it?" Blake turned, startled. Ernesto, the bread vendor, stood beside him, his cart parked nearby. "I don't know what you mean," Blake replied automatically. Ernesto smiled knowingly. "I've been watching you watch them. No ordinary rich man comes back to a neighborhood like this unless he has a reason, and suddenly the school gets a miracle donation?" Blake didn't confirm or deny, just turned back to the window. "She's a special kid," Ernesto continued. "All heart, that one. Takes after her mother. Sarah's raised those children alone since her husband left 5 years ago. Works herself to exhaustion. Never complains." "How do you know them so well?" Blake asked. "In neighborhoods like this, we look out for each other. Sarah helps with my grandchildren sometimes. I make sure Lily and her brothers never go hungry even when money's tight." He gave Blake a sidelong glance. "That's something you probably don't understand in your world. Community." The observation stung because it was true. Blake had associates, not friends, business connections, not community. His penthouse was in a building where neighbors barely acknowledged each other in the elevator. "I'm learning," Blake said quietly. Ernesto nodded toward the school. "Why don't you go in, see what your money bought?" "I prefer to keep my distance." Afraid of getting too close, Ernesto's perception was uncomfortably sharp. Money's easy to give when you have plenty. Time and attention, that's the real sacrifice. For a man like you. Before Blake could respond, he spotted Lily exiting the school, looking around the playground. Her eyes found him almost immediately, as if she'd been searching. She said something to her mother, then walked directly toward where Blake and Ernesto stood. "Mr. Harrington," she said when she reached them. "I thought it might be you." "Hello, Lily," Blake replied, surprised by how pleased he felt at her recognition. "You did this, didn't you?" "The library." Blake glanced at Ernesto, who raised his eyebrows as if to say, "I told you so." "Would it matter if I did?" Blake asked. Lily considered this seriously. "Yes, because then I could thank you properly. Our old books were so outdated. They still said Berlin had a wall dividing it." Blake smiled despite himself. "That is outdated." "So it was you?" He hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said simply. "Hey, it's the nicest thing anyone's ever done for our school." Her sincerity was disarming. There was no flattery in her gratitude, no attempt to leverage his generosity for more, just honest appreciation. "You're welcome," Blake replied, feeling strangely humble. "I hope the books are good ones. They're wonderful. I already found 3 I want to read." She looked at him curiously. "Why didn't you want anyone to know it was you?" It was a good question, one Blake hadn't fully examined himself. Sometimes it's better to do things quietly. Lily seemed to accept this. My mom says true kindness doesn't need an audience. Your mom sounds wise. She is. You should meet. Her. Lily turned, pointing to where Sarah stood watching them with concerned curiosity. Mum, come meet Mr. Harrington. Blake felt a surge of panic. This wasn't part of his plan. He'd intended to remain anonymous, to help from a distance, to maintain the boundary between his world and theirs. But Sarah was already approaching, her younger sons trailing behind her. Mum, this is Mr. Harrington, Lily said. He's the one who donated the new library. Sarah Thompson was younger than Blake had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the same dark, expressive eyes as her daughter. Exhaustion lined her face, but couldn't diminish a natural beauty that required no enhancement. She extended her hand, her expression a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Sarah Thompson, it seems we owe you a tremendous thank you, Mr. Harrington. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. Blake was struck by her dignity. There was no subservience in her manner despite the obvious disparity in their circumstances. Please call me Blake, and no thanks necessary. Your daughter did me a far greater service. Lily mentioned helping. Someone at the train crossing, that was you. Blake nodded. She quite literally saved my life. I was distracted, didn't see the train coming. Well, I'm glad she was there, Sarah said, her expression softening slightly, and grateful for your generosity to our school. The children are beside themselves with excitement. It's the least I could do. An awkward silence fell. They were from such different worlds, with so little common ground. Mr. Harrington is rich, Mom, one of Lily's brothers announced matter-of-factly, breaking the tension. His car costs more than our building. Jason, Sarah admonished, but Blake laughed. He's probably right, he admitted. Sorry, Sarah said. Kids have no filter. I find it refreshing, actually. I'm surrounded by people who carefully measure every word. Sarah glanced at her watch. We should get home. I have the night shift at the diner. Lily, make sure your brothers finish their homework before bed. Yes, Mom, Lily replied with the patience of a child accustomed to responsibility beyond her years. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Harrington, Sarah said. And truly, thank you for the library. It means more than you know. As they turned to leave, Blake found himself reluctant to end the encounter. Perhaps I could give you a ride home. It would be no trouble. Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the offer. That's very kind, but we only live a few blocks away. Of course, Blake said quickly. I understand. I want to ride in the fancy car, Jason exclaimed, earning another reproachful look from his mother. Lily studied Blake with those perceptive eyes. Maybe Mr. Harrington could come to dinner sometime instead. You make the best lasagna, Mum. Sarah looked mortified. Lily, Mr. Harrington is a busy man. I'm sure he has more important things to do than have dinner with us. Blake should have agreed, should have made a polite excuse and retreated to the safety of his own world. Instead, he heard himself say, Actually, I'd be honored. If the invitation is genuine. Sarah blinked in surprise. Well, of course. But our apartment is very small and size doesn't matter when there's good company, Blake said, surprising himself with the sincerity of the sentiment. And I haven't had homemade lasagna in years. Sarah's expression was unreadable. Sunday. At 6. It's my only day off. Sunday at 6 would be perfect, Blake replied. And please let me bring something. Wine? Dessert? Ice cream, Jason suggested enthusiastically. Sarah laughed, a warm, genuine sound. Ice cream would be lovely, Mr. Harrington. Blake, please. Blake, she repeated, the name sounding different in her voice. Until Sunday, then. As Blake watched them walk away, Ernesto chuckled beside him. Well, that wasn't part of your plan, was it? No, Blake admitted. It wasn't. Good, Ernesto said approvingly. The best things in life rarely are. Sunday arrived with unexpected nervousness. Blake, who regularly negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, found himself standing in a gourmet ice cream shop, paralyzed by indecision. We have 37 flavors, sir, the clerk repeated patiently. Perhaps you could narrow down your preferences. What do children like? Blake asked, realizing immediately how ridiculous the question sounded. The P. Clark suppressed a smile. Most kids enjoy the classics: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. Our cookie dough and birthday cake flavors are also popular. I'll take all of those, Blake decided. And what would their mother like? I couldn't say, sir. Women have varied tastes. Blake frowned, trying to imagine Sarah Thompson's preferences. He knew almost nothing about her beyond her circumstances. Something sophisticated but not pretentious. Sweet but not cloying. The clerk considered this. Perhaps our sea salt caramel or Madagascar vanilla bean, or our dark chocolate with cherry. Yes, those as well, and I'll take whatever your most popular adult flavors are. By the time Blake left the shop, he was carrying 3 insulated bags, containing 12 pints of premium ice cream. It was excessive, absurd even, but somehow it felt important to get this right. He drove to the Bronx with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. What had possessed him to accept this dinner invitation? What could he possibly have in common with this family? Yet he felt drawn to them, to the authenticity they represented. The apartment building looked smaller than he remembered. The green, Dr. Moore faded. Blake parked his Aston Martin, which he now realized was offensively luxurious in this setting, and gathered the ice cream bags. A group of teenagers on the stoop watched him with undisguised curiosity as he entered the building. The interior was clean but worn, with cracked linoleum and flickering fluorescent lights. A handwritten sign indicated the elevator was out of order. Blake climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, following the faint smell of tomato sauce and garlic. Apartment 3B had a wreath of artificial flowers on the door, a small touch of beauty amid the institutional drabness of the hallway. Blake took a deep breath and knocked. The door swung open immediately as if someone had been waiting just behind it. Jason grinned up at him, missing his 2 front teeth. "Mum, he's here, and he brought lots of ice cream." Sarah appeared behind, her son wiping her hands on a dishcloth. She wore simple jeans and a blue blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Without the fatigue that had marked her face at their first meeting, she was strikingly beautiful. "Mr. Harrington." "Blake. Please come in." "Jason, let our guest through the door." Blake stepped into a living room that also served as dining room and apparently playroom as well. The space was small but immaculately clean, furnished with mismatched pieces that somehow created a cohesive whole. Colorful children's artwork adorned the walls and bookshelves overflowed with well-worn volumes. I may have gone overboard with the ice cream," Blake admitted, holding up the bags. Sarah laughed. "I can see that. Our freezer's quite small, but we'll make it work. Lily, can you help clear some space?" Lily emerged from the kitchen area, her smile shy but welcoming. "Hi, Mr. Harrington." "Hi, Lily. I brought cookie dough ice cream. I heard kids like that." "It's my favorite," she confirmed, taking one of the bags. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess," Blake replied, feeling ridiculously pleased with himself. The youngest brother, whom Blake now knew was named Michael, peeked out from behind a doorway, regarding their visitor with solemn curiosity. "Come say hello to Mr. Harrington." "Mikey," Sarah encouraged gently. The boy approached cautiously. "Your car is pretty," he said finally. "Thank you," Blake replied, crouching to the child's level. "Maybe someday I could take you for a ride in it." Michael's eyes widened. "Really? With the top down?" "If your mother approves, absolutely." Sarah gave Blake a grateful look. "Dinner's almost ready. Can I get you something to drink?" "We have water, tea, lemonade. I'm afraid we don't have anything stronger." "Lemonade would be perfect," Blake said, straightening up. "Can I help with anything?" "Everything's under control, please. Make yourself comfortable." Blake took a seat on the modestly sized sofa, acutely aware of how out of place he must appear in his casual designer clothes that probably cost more than a month of Sarah's salary. Jason immediately sat beside him, full of questions about his car, his job, whether he owned a helicopter. "No, but I've chartered them occasionally," and if he knew any famous people. "Jason, give Mr. Harrington some space," Sarah called from the kitchen. "It's fine," Blake assured her. I rarely get such honest conversation. Dinner was served at a small table that had been carefully set with mismatched but clean dishes and a vase of fresh daisies at the center. The lasagna was nothing. Like the refined northern Italian cuisine Blake was accustomed to at high-end restaurants. It was hearty, flavorful, and undeniably made with care, perhaps the most delicious meal he'd had in years. "This is incredible," he said after his first bite, the compliment entirely genuine. Sarah looked pleased. "It's my grandmother's recipe. Nothing fancy, but the kids love it. I can see why. I don't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal." "Really?" Lily looked surprised. "Who cooks for you?" "I have a chef who prepares meals when I need them, but I eat at restaurants most of the time." "That's sad," she said simply. "Lily?" Sarah admonished gently. "No, she's right," Blake said. "It is sad. I just never thought of it that way." The conversation flowed surprisingly easily. Sarah asked thoughtful questions about his work, showing an unexpected understanding of finance and business. Blake learned she had been halfway through a business degree when she'd become pregnant with Lily and had to leave school to work full-time. "I keep saying I'll go back someday," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "But somehow, someday, keeps getting pushed further away." "Have you looked into online programs?" Blake asked. "Many universities offer flexible options now. Between 2 jobs and 3 kids, finding time is the challenge, and those programs aren't cheap, even online." Blake wanted to offer financial assistance on the spot, but held back, sensing she would perceive it as charity rather than opportunity. Instead, he filed the information away, an idea already forming. After dinner, they had ice cream, each child choosing their favorite from Blake's excessive selection, and played a board game that Michael insisted Blake would enjoy. It was a simple game of chance and matching, but Blake found himself genuinely engaged, caught up in the children's excitement and competitive spirit. When Lily triumphantly won the final round, Blake checked his watch, surprised to discover it was already past 9. "I should probably be going. You all have school and work tomorrow." Was it his imagination, or did Sarah look disappointed? "Of course, thank you for coming and for the ice cream. We'll be enjoying it for weeks." "Thank you for having me. It's been—" Blake searched for the right word. "Refreshing." As Sarah walked him to the door, the children called their goodbyes from the living room, already setting up another game. "They like you," Sarah said quietly. "That's not something I would have expected." "Nor I," Blake admitted. "I don't have much experience with children." "You're a natural, actually." She hesitated, then added, "You're not what I expected, Blake Harrington." "What did you expect?" "I looked you up after we met," she confessed. "Harrington Capital has a certain reputation, ruthless, profit at any cost." Blake couldn't deny it. "That's accurate, historically speaking. Yet you donate anonymously to school libraries and play board games with children and bring 12 flavors of ice cream because you're not sure what they'll like." She studied him curiously. "It's a contradiction." "I'm experiencing a lot of those lately," Blake said. "Things that seemed simple before suddenly aren't." "Since the day at the train crossing?" He nodded. "Your daughter did more than save my life. She made me question what I was doing with it." Sarah's expression softened. "That sounds like Lily. She has a way of seeing through to what matters." They stood in the doorway, an unexpectedly intimate moment in the fluorescent-lit hallway. Blake found himself reluctant to leave, to return to his empty penthouse and the endless cycle of acquisition and accumulation that had defined his existence. "Would it be presumptuous to ask if I might come again?" he asked suddenly. Sarah looked, surprised, then thoughtful. "Not presumptuous, but I'm curious why you'd want to." "Because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I enjoyed myself without any agenda or expectation of return. Because your children are delightful. Because your lasagna is better than anything I've eaten at restaurants with 3 Michelin stars." He paused, then added more softly, "And because I'd like to get to know you better, Sarah Thompson." She blushed slightly, the color warming her olive complexion. "I'm a single mother with 3 kids, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. You're a billionaire CEO. Those worlds don't typically intersect." "They've already intersected," Blake pointed. Out. The question is whether we allow them to connect. Sarah considered this, then nodded slowly. The kids have a school concert next Friday evening. Nothing fancy, just the spring music program. They'd be thrilled if you came. I'd be honored, Blake replied, meaning it. Thank you for a wonderful evening, Sarah. Good night, Blake. As he drove back to Manhattan, the glittering skyline seemed less impressive than before, the luxury of his lifestyle feeling hollow compared to the warmth of the modest apartment he'd just left. Blake found himself thinking about Sarah, her quiet strength, her dignity, the intelligence behind her tired eyes. She was unlike anyone in his social circle, genuine in a way that made his usual interactions seem painfully artificial. His phone rang through the car's system. It was Jonathan Pearson. Blake, we need to discuss the new strategy document before tomorrow's executive committee meeting. There are several points that need clarification, particularly regarding the proposed changes to our acquisition criteria. Can it wait until morning, Jonathan? I'm just heading home. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you all evening. I had dinner with friends, Blake replied, the word friends feeling strange yet right. Friends, Pearson repeated skeptically. Since when do you have friends outside of business associates? There's a lot you don't know about me, Jonathan. Apparently so. You've been different since that day you disappeared, distracted. The board is beginning to notice. The board should be pleased. Westbrook is proceeding as planned, and our quarterly projections are on target. Yes, but there's talk about your proposed changes to our community investment policies. Charitable giving is one thing, Blake, but you're suggesting a fundamental shift in our corporate responsibility approach. I am, Blake confirmed, and I believe it's not only ethically sound, but strategically advantageous in the long term. Pearson sighed heavily. Just be prepared for pushback tomorrow, and Blake, whatever's going on with you, don't let it interfere with what we've built. After ending the call, Blake sat in his parked car in the garage beneath his building, reluctant to return to his penthouse. For the first time, he saw his life clearly. The hollow achievement, the meaningless accumulation of wealth, the absence of genuine connection. Something was changing within him, a transformation set in motion by a child's simple act of compassion. And Blake was beginning to believe it might be the most important deal of his life. Over the next 2 months, Blake found himself living in parallel worlds. By day, he continued leading Harrington Capital with outward precision and control, though subtle changes were becoming apparent to those who knew him well. He vetoed a planned acquisition that would have resulted in mass layoffs. He implemented a more generous parental leave policy. He even started learning employees' names beyond his immediate executive team. But his evenings and weekends increasingly belonged to the Bronx. He attended Lily's school concert as promised, sitting awkwardly among parents who eyed his expensive clothes with suspicion until the Thompson children spotted him and waved enthusiastically. He helped Michael build a science project, taught Jason how to play chess, and spent hours discussing books with Lily, whose intelligence and perception continued to amaze him. And then there was Sarah. Their relationship had evolved cautiously, with boundaries both spoken and unspoken. She refused his offers of financial assistance, but accepted smaller gestures, fixing the temperamental refrigerator in her apartment, providing tickets to a museum exhibit the children wanted to see, occasionally picking them up from school when her work schedule created conflicts. They'd begun meeting for coffee when she had breaks between jobs, brief interludes of adult conversation that Blake found himself anticipating with embarrassing eagerness. Sarah was fascinating, well-read despite her limited formal education, insightful about human nature, and possessing a quiet wisdom that made Blake's hard-charging business associates seem shallow by comparison. She challenged him in ways no one else dared, questioned his assumptions about success and worth, and never seemed impressed by his wealth or position. To her, these were incidental characteristics, not defining ones. She cared more about how he treated her children, how he spoke to the elderly neighbors in her building, whether he remembered to bring the raspberry jam Lily preferred with her. Breakfast. Blake was falling for her, and it terrified him. You seem distracted today, Caroline Foster observed, as they reviewed the latest initiatives from Blake's foundation. They sat in his office, surrounded by reports detailing the progress of various projects in the Bronx neighborhood. After-school programs, small business grants, healthcare services, housing renovations. Just thinking about next steps, Blake replied, refocusing on the documents before him. The community center renovations are behind schedule. Construction delays are normal, Caroline said. But that's not what's bothering you. Blake raised an eyebrow. Since when do you psychoanalyze? Me, Caroline? Since you started spending 3 evenings a week in the Bronx, she replied bluntly. Your calendar isn't a state secret, Blake, and your driver talks. I wasn't aware my personal time was subject to corporate surveillance. It's not surveillance when people notice obvious changes. Caroline leaned forward. Look, whatever's happening, it's affecting your work. Not negatively, quite the opposite, actually. You're more engaged with our community programs than ever before. You're asking questions about social impact that never interested you previously. The board may be concerned, but I find it refreshing. Blake studied her thoughtfully. Caroline had worked for him for 6 years, managing his philanthropy with efficient professionalism, but he realized he knew almost nothing about her as a person. Why did you choose this line of work, Caroline? He asked suddenly. She looked surprised by the question. Non-profit management? Yes, you're obviously intelligent, capable. You could have pursued more lucrative paths. Some things matter more than money, she said simply. I grew up in public housing in Chicago. An after-school program kept me off the streets, helped me get into college on scholarship. I've never forgotten that. Blake nodded slowly. I didn't know. You never asked. There was no reproach in her tone, just statement of fact. We all have stories that shape us, Blake. What's yours? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? Something changed you. The man I've worked for all these years wouldn't care about renovating community centers or funding preschool programs. He certainly wouldn't be spending time in a neighborhood where the median income is below the poverty line. Blake was saved from responding by his intercom. Mr. Harrington, Mr. Pearson is here to see you, Vanessa announced. Caroline gathered her materials. We'll continue this later. The community center contractor needs a decision on the expanded budget by tomorrow. Approve it, Blake said immediately. Whatever they need to get back on schedule. She nodded and left, passing Jonathan Pearson in the doorway. The board chairman entered without waiting for an invitation, his expression tense. We need to talk, Blake, he said, closing the door firmly behind him. Good afternoon to you too, Jonathan. Blake leaned back in his chair, already anticipating the confrontation. What's on your mind? This. Pearson tossed a folder onto Blake's desk. Inside were photographs. Blake entering Sarah's apartment building. Blake with the Thompson children. At a park. Blake and Sarah sitting at a cafe. You're having me followed now? Blake asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The board hired a security consultant to assess potential vulnerabilities. Your activities came up in their review. My personal life is not a corporate vulnerability. It is when you're spending time in high-crime neighborhoods with people we know nothing about. Pearson sat down, his expression softening slightly. Blake, we're concerned. This behavior is erratic, out of character. First the missed meetings, then the policy changes, now this involvement with some random family in the Bronx. It raises questions. What questions exactly? Are you being manipulated, blackmailed? Is there something we should know about this woman and her children? Blake felt a surge of anger so intense it momentarily robbed him of speech. When he finally responded, his voice was cold and precise. Sarah Thompson is a hard-working single mother who has never asked me for a dime. Her daughter saved my life. Their family has shown me more genuine kindness than I've experienced in 20 years on Wall Street. If the board has concerns about my judgment, they're welcome to call a vote. Until then, my personal life remains. Exactly that. Personal. Pearson studied him for a long moment. You care about these people? Yes. Particularly the mother. Blake didn't respond, which was answer enough. Pearson sighed. "Blake, I've known you for 15 years. I've seen you close deals, crush competitors, build this company from a modest fund to a financial powerhouse. But I've never seen you genuinely care about another human being." He tapped the folder. "It makes you unpredictable, and in our business, unpredictable is dangerous. Perhaps our business could benefit from more humanity, not less." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Pearson said, exasperated. 6 months ago, you would have laughed at that statement. You built your reputation on being coldly rational, on never letting sentiment interfere with strategy. People evolve, Jonathan. Not successful people in their 40s, not without a reason. Pearson leaned forward. "What happened that day?" "Blake, the day you disappeared and came back different." Blake considered telling him the truth, about the train, about Lily, about the moment he'd looked into a child's eyes and seen the emptiness of his own existence reflected back at him. But he doubted Pearson would understand. "Let's just say I had a moment of clarity," he said instead. "And now you're what? Slumming it with this woman and her kids to feel better about yourself? Playing philanthropist to wash away the sins of capitalism?" Blake's expression hardened. "Be very careful, Jonathan." Pearson held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm trying to understand, because the board is asking questions I can't answer. They're wondering if you're still committed to Harrington Capital's future. The company is performing well. The Westbrook integration is ahead of schedule. Our Q2 numbers exceeded projections. Yes, and simultaneously, you're pouring millions into that neighborhood through your foundation, implementing policy changes that prioritize social impact over maximizing returns, and spending your free time playing house with a family that, frankly, is so far outside your social sphere it's absurd." Blake stood, his patience exhausted. "This meeting is over. Tell the board that my personal life is off limits for discussion, and if they ever authorize surveillance on me again, I'll take legal action." "You're making a mistake, Blake," Pearson said, rising as well. "Whatever midlife crisis you're experiencing, there are more appropriate ways to address it, ways that don't risk everything you've built." After Pearson left, Blake stood at his window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. 6 months ago, he would have seen it as a testament to human achievement, a concrete and glass monument to ambition and success. Now he saw the shadows between the buildings, the invisible lines dividing privilege from poverty, opportunity from struggle. His phone vibrated with a text from Sarah. "Lily got the lead in the school play. She's over the moon and wants you to be the first to know." Blake smiled, feeling a warmth that had become increasingly familiar. He texted back, "Tell her I'm incredibly proud and wouldn't miss it for anything." Then he called Vanessa into his office. "I need you to clear my GI schedule for tomorrow afternoon and contact legal. I want to review the structure of my ownership stake in the company." "May I ask why?" Vanessa inquired, her professional composure not quite hiding her curiosity. "I'm considering some changes," Blake replied. "Significant ones." That evening, Blake drove to the Bronx as usual, but his mind was turbulent with conflicting thoughts. He found Sarah waiting outside her building, a rare moment when she wasn't rushing between responsibilities. She wore a simple sundress, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking younger and more carefree than he'd ever seen her. "The kids are with my neighbor for an hour," she explained as she got into his car. "Lily's practicing her lines non-stop, and I needed a break before my brain explodes from hearing the same monologue 50 times. Blake laughed, momentarily pushing aside his troubled thoughts. "Where to?" "Anywhere quiet," Sarah said. "Just drive." They ended up at a small park overlooking the river, sitting on a bench as the sun began its descent, painting the water with golden light. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence. "Something's bothering you," Sarah finally said. It wasn't a question. Blake glanced at her, not surprised by her perception. "Is it that obvious?" "To me, yes." She turned to face him more directly. "What is it?" "The board is concerned about my involvement here with you and the children." Sarah's expression tightened. "I see. They hired someone to follow me. They had photographs of me, of my children." Her voice had an edge now, protective and fierce. Nothing inappropriate or invasive, just documenting my visits. And that bothers them because it represents a change they don't understand, because they think it's affecting my judgment. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Is it? Yes, Blake admitted, but not in the way they believe. I see things differently now. Priorities that once seemed absolute now seem arbitrary. Successes that once felt significant now feel hollow. And they're blaming me for this. They're looking for an explanation. You're the most visible change in my life. Sarah stood, walking, a few steps away, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. I've always known this was temporary, she said quietly. A billionaire CEO doesn't suddenly decide to become part of the lives of a struggling family in the Bronx without some deeper motivation. Curiosity, novelty, charity. Eventually, the experiment ends, and everyone returns to their proper worlds. Blake felt as if she'd struck him. Is that what you think this is, an experiment? She turned back to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. What else could it be, Blake? Look at us. Look at where we come from, the lives we lead. You live in a penthouse with a view of the city that probably cost more than I'll earn in my lifetime. I live in a 3-room apartment with walls so thin I can hear my neighbors arguing about grocery lists. Those are just circumstances, Blake argued, standing to join her. They don't define who we are. But they shape us. They limit us. They create expectations and possibilities that don't easily cross the divide between your world and mine. I don't accept that, Blake said firmly. Those limitations only exist if we allow them to. Sarah's expression was a mixture of affection and resignation. It's easy for you to say that. You have the power to move between worlds. I don't. What if you did? Blake asked suddenly. What if you could finish your degree, pursue the career you wanted, create the life you envisioned before circumstances forced you onto a different path? That's a lovely fantasy, Sarah said gently. It doesn't have to be fantasy, Blake insisted. I have resources, connections, I could help. And there it is, Sarah interrupted, stepping back. The solution you've been wanting to offer all along. Fix the poor woman's problems with money. That's not what isn't it? You see my struggles and your instinct is to solve them the way you solve business problems. Throw resources at the situation until it resolves. I just want to help, Blake said, frustrated by her resistance. What's wrong with that? Nothing, if it's the right kind of help. Sarah's voice softened. Blake, I care about you. More than I expected to, more than is probably wise. But I won't be your charity case or your redemption story. I won't allow my children to become dependent on generosity that could disappear as quickly as it appeared. You think I would abandon them? Abandon you? I think good intentions don't always last. I think the board's concerns won't simply go away. I think eventually you'll have to choose between the world you built and whatever this is between us. She gestured between them. And I'm not sure you're ready to make that choice. Blake felt a strange sense of clarity washing over him, as if Sarah's words had crystallized something he'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. What if I already have? He asked quietly. Sarah looked at him questioningly. I'm restructuring my ownership in Harrington Capital, Blake explained. Transitioning operational control to a management team, maintaining a significant stake, but stepping back from day-to-day leadership. What? Why would you do that? Because I've built something that no longer reflects my values. Because success measured purely in profit margins feels increasingly meaningless. Because I want the freedom to pursue things that matter more. Things like what? Blake stepped closer, taking her hands in his. Like community development that creates opportunity instead of just charity. Like using my experience and connections to help neighborhoods like yours. Build sustainable economic foundations. Like spending time with 3 amazing children who have taught me more about courage and joy than all my years in business. He paused, gathering his courage. Like exploring whatever this is between us, without the constraints of my corporate identity or your understandable wariness. Sarah looked stunned. You would give up your company for this? Not give up, transform, redirect, and not just for this for me. for the person I want to be rather than the person I became while chasing some hollow definition of success. She studied his face, searching for doubt or hesitation. This is a massive change, Blake. Are you sure? More sure than I've been about anything in years. He smiled slightly. A wise woman recently told me that true kindness doesn't need an audience. I'm beginning to understand what that means. Sarah's expression softened, a cautious hope replacing her earlier resignation. And what does Jonathan Pearson think about this plan? He doesn't know yet. No one does except you. Why tell me first? Because your opinion matters to me, because I don't want to make another major life decision without considering its impact on people I care about. Blake hesitated, then added softly, because I'm falling in love with you, Sarah Thompson, and I wanted you to know who I'm choosing to become before asking if there might be a place for me in your life. Sarah's eyes widened at his confession. For a moment she seemed unable to respond. Then slowly she moved closer, resting one hand against his cheek. You're really serious about this, she said wonderingly. Completely. She shook her head, slightly, a mix of disbelief and affection in her expression. You know it won't be easy. Your board will fight you. Your social circle won't understand. There will be gossip, judgments, complications we can't even anticipate. Probably, Blake agreed. Does that scare you? Sarah laughed softly. I'm a single mother with 3 kids working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Very little scares me anymore. Her expression grew serious again. But I won't let my children be hurt. If we do this, whatever this is becoming, they come first. Always. I wouldn't have it any other way, Blake promised. They're extraordinary, Sarah. You've raised incredible human beings. They like you too, you know, especially Lily. She's convinced you're some kind of guardian angel sent to help us. Blake smiled at the irony. She's got it backwards. She's the one who saved me. As the sun set over the river, casting long shadows across the park, Blake, Harrington and Sarah Thompson sat together on a bench that bridged 2 worlds, planning a future neither could have imagined just months before. And somewhere in the space between them, invisible but palpable, was the spirit of a child's simple act of compassion that had started it all. 6 months later, Blake stood at the podium in the newly renovated community center, surrounded by residents, local officials, and a small group of journalists. The building, once a neglected municipal space with leaking ceilings and outdated facilities, now gleamed with fresh paint, modern equipment, and thoughtfully designed spaces for everything from childcare to job training. Today marks not an ending but a beginning, Blake said, his voice carrying through the state-of-the-art sound system. This center belongs to all of you, a place to gather, to learn, to grow, and to build the future of this community together. From the front row, Sarah watched him with quiet pride, flanked by her children and several neighbors who had become friends over the past months. Lily, now 11 and increasingly confident in her role as unofficial community ambassador, beamed as Blake acknowledged the youth council she had helped establish. None of this would have been possible without the vision and determination of our young leaders, Blake continued, gesturing toward Lily and her peers. They've shown us what's possible when we listen to those who see potential, where others see only problems. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Many had been skeptical when Blake first proposed the Community Development Initiative, suspicious of his motives, wary of promises from wealthy outsiders who typically appeared only for photo opportunities before disappearing again. But Blake had proven different, becoming a regular presence in the neighborhood, listening more than speaking, learning from residents rather than imposing solutions. As the ceremony concluded and people moved toward the reception area, Blake made his way to Sarah, accepting handshakes and thanks from community members along the way. "You did good," she said when he reached her, her voice warm with affection. "We did good," he corrected, squeezing her hand. This was always a collective effort. "Still, it wouldn't have happened without you." "Or without Lily," Blake added, smiling at the girl who was currently explaining the center's new computer lab to some younger children. "Everything good in my life these days can be traced back to her standing on that train crossing." Sarah leaned against him slightly, a small gesture of intimacy they now shared comfortably. "Have I thanked you recently for nearly getting hit by a train?" Blake laughed. "Not in at least a week." Their relationship had evolved gradually and deliberately over the past months, built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than romantic impulse. They had taken careful steps, mindful of the children's feelings and the complexity of bridging their different worlds. But the connection between them had only deepened with time, weathering the challenges that came with Blake's transformation and their increasingly intertwined lives. Across the room, Jonathan Pearson stood observing the scene with an expression of reluctant admiration. Blake excused himself from Sarah and approached his former chairman. "Jonathan, I'm surprised you came." Pearson shrugged slightly. "Professional curiosity. When one of Wall Street's most ruthless operators suddenly becomes a community development advocate, it warrants investigation." "And what's your verdict?" Blake asked. "Genuinely curious." "Impressive," Pearson admitted. "The board thought you'd lost your mind. I thought you were having a midlife crisis, but this—" He gestured around the bustling community center. "This is substantive, strategic even, in its own way. It's about creating sustainable change, not just charity," Blake explained. "Economic opportunity, educational access, safe spaces for families. These things generate their own momentum when properly supported." "So I see." Pearson studied him for a moment. "You seem happy, Blake. I don't think I've ever been able to say that before." "I am happy," Blake confirmed, "happier than I knew was possible. And Harrington Capital survives without your daily presence. Though I must say, your occasional strategic input remains invaluable." Blake smiled. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been tense board meetings, threatened lawsuits, even attempts to force him out entirely. But his ownership stake and legal position had been too strong to overcome, and eventually a new equilibrium had been established. Blake remained a significant shareholder and advisor, but had relinquished operational control to focus on his foundation's work. "The company was never meant to be my entire life," Blake said. "I just forgot that somewhere along the way." "And now?" Pearson glanced toward Sarah, who was chatting with the center's new director. "Is she your entire life instead?" "She's part of it," Blake replied. "An important part. But no, I've learned not to define myself through any single dimension, not work, not relationships, not even philanthropy. Life is richer when it's balanced." Pearson nodded thoughtfully. "Well, whatever epiphany you had that day on the train tracks, it seems to have served you well." He extended his hand. "Congratulations on all of this, Blake. It's not the path I would have chosen, but I can't argue with the results." After Pearson departed, Blake found himself momentarily alone, watching the diverse gathering of people enjoying the space. Children exploring the new playground equipment, teenagers clustered around the music studio, elderly residents examining the schedule of health and wellness programs. "Mr. Harrington," a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. Blake turned to find Ernesto, the bread vendor, standing nearby. Older now, with more gray in his hair, but still carrying himself with the same dignified warmth. "Ernesto," Blake greeted him with genuine pleasure. "I'm glad you could make it. And please, it's just Blake." "Old habits," Ernesto smiled. "I wanted to congratulate you. This place, what you've done for the neighborhood. It's remarkable." "Thank you, but I sense there's something else on your mind." Ernesto nodded, his expression growing more serious. "I've been watching you these past months. The way you interact with people here, the respect you show, the genuine effort to understand rather than impose solutions. I've had good teachers," Blake said, glancing toward Lily, who was now showing Michael how to use the new art supplies in the children's corner. "Yes, that child has wisdom beyond her years," Ernesto agreed. "But so do you, in your own way. You could have thrown money at this neighborhood and walked away feeling virtuous. Many rich people do exactly that. Instead, you became part of it." Blake was touched by the observation. Coming from Ernesto, who had initially regarded him with justified suspicion, it felt particularly meaningful. "The neighborhood has given me far more than I've given it," Blake said honestly. "Perhaps. But there's something I've been wondering," Ernesto continued. What made you come back that first day? After Lily warned you about the train, you could have simply driven away, sent a thank you gift, moved on with your life. Why did you return? It was a question Blake had asked himself many times. The answer had evolved as his understanding of himself deepened, but the core remained the same. I saw something in her eyes, he explained. Something I'd lost in myself long ago. A recognition of our shared humanity, I suppose. The understanding that we matter to each other, not because of what we own or achieve, but simply because we exist. Ernesto nodded slowly. Compassion. The girl showed compassion without calculation, and it awakened something in you. Yes, Blake agreed. Exactly that. And now you show the same to others. Ernesto gestured toward the community gathered around them. It's a beautiful circle. As the afternoon progressed, Blake found himself drawn into conversations with residents about future initiatives, a small business incubator, a college scholarship program, expanded healthcare services. His foundation had grown beyond its initial focus on this single neighborhood, now supporting similar community-led development projects across the city, but this place remained special, the heart of his new purpose. Later, as the event wound down, Blake helped the staff clean up while Sarah organized the children's art supplies. They worked in comfortable tandem, their rhythm evidence of the partnership they'd built over months of shared efforts and growing closeness. I have something to show you, Blake said when they finished. A surprise. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Another one? The community center wasn't enough? This is different, personal. He took her hand. Will you come with me? They walked several blocks to a street Sarah knew well, her own. But instead of turning toward her apartment building, Blake led her to a brownstone that had been undergoing renovation for months, its facade now restored to its original elegance. What are we doing here? Sarah asked, confused. Imagining possibilities, Blake replied, producing a key and opening the front door. Inside, the space was warm and inviting. Hardwood floors, large windows, walls painted in the soft colors Sarah had once mentioned, she loved. The furniture was modest but high quality, comfortable rather than showy. Family photographs, Sarah's children at various ages, had been artfully arranged on one wall. Sarah turned to him in astonishment. Blake, what is this? A home, he said simply, if you want it to be. She walked through the rooms slowly, touching surfaces, looking out windows, her expression a mixture of wonder and caution. I don't understand. I bought the building, Blake explained, following her. Renovated it as a multi-family dwelling. There are 3 apartments, this one, which could be ours, and 2 others that provide rental income to maintain the property. Ours? Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake took a deep breath. I love you, Sarah. I love your children. These past months have shown me what life can be when it's built around connection and purpose rather than acquisition and competition. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. This isn't just about a house, it's about a future together if you want that too. Sarah stared at the box, then at Blake, her eyes filling with tears. Are you proposing? I'm proposing possibilities, Blake said gently. A home together. A life together. A partnership in every sense, but only if it feels right to you and to Lily, Jason, and Michael. They already think of you as family, Sarah said softly. Especially Lily. She told me last week that she thinks you were always meant to be part of our lives, that the train that day wasn't an accident but a beginning. Wise beyond her years, Blake smiled. But what about you, Sarah? What do you want? She looked around the beautiful space he had created, with her preferences in mind, then back at the man who had transformed himself from a cold corporate titan into someone capable of profound compassion and genuine love. I want this, she said, stepping closer to him. I want us, but I need you to understand something important. Anything. I fell in love with the man you became, not because of what you could provide or how you could change our circumstances. If we lived in my apartment forever, if you lost everything tomorrow, my feelings wouldn't change. Blake's heart swelled with emotion. I know that, he said. It's one of the countless reasons I love you." He opened the box, revealing not an ostentatious diamond, but a simple, elegant ring with a small emerald, the color of Sarah's eyes. "Sarah Thompson, will you marry me? Will you and your extraordinary children create a family with me?" Sarah's smile was radiant through her tears. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "yes." As Blake slipped the ring onto her finger, a sound at the doorway made them both turn. Lily stood there, flanked by her brothers, all three wearing expressions of barely contained excitement. "You knew about this?" Sarah asked, laughing through her tears. "We helped pick the paint colors," Jason announced proudly, "and the furniture," Michael added. Lily simply walked forward and hugged them both. "I told you he was meant for us, Mum." As the children explored their potential new home, exclaiming over bedrooms designed with their interests in mind and a backyard perfect for summer evenings, Blake and Sarah stood by the window, watching the neighborhood that had brought them together. "Did you ever imagine this?" Sarah asked, leaning against him. "6 months ago, when you were sitting in your car on those train tracks?" "Never," Blake admitted. "I couldn't have conceived of this life, this feeling." He turned to her. "But now I can't imagine any other path." From the kitchen, they heard the children debating pizza toppings for their celebratory dinner, their first meal in what would become their new home. The ordinary, beautiful sound of family life. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "for all your wealth and power, the most valuable thing you've given us is simply yourself, your time, your attention, your heart." Blake nodded, understanding the profound truth in her words. "And for all your challenges and struggles, the most valuable thing you've given me is perspective, showing me what truly matters, what's worth building a life around." As they joined the children in the kitchen, Blake reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him here, from a man who measured worth only in dollars to someone who found richness in connection, purpose in service, and joy in the simple act of being present for those he loved. It had begun with a child's compassion on a train crossing, a moment of pure humanity that had awakened something long dormant within him. And it had led to this, a family formed not by obligation or circumstance but by choice and love, a community strengthened through genuine investment rather than mere charity, and a life redefined around what truly mattered. Blake Harrington, once the coldest heart on Wall Street, had finally come home.